Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Today, I'm going to look at Liam Stanley's book, Britain Alone. I believe that a sure sign of a society that's kind of in crisis is its addiction to nostalgia. To the idea, I did a whole podcast on nostalgia probably about the start of this year, and the idea that things are now today worse than they were, or that there has been some kind of golden age that we seem to be incapable of recapturing. Um, and nostalgia in Britain, I think, in the past 25 years particularly, has become extremely toxic. And it's been a key part of the kind of the use of culture wars waged by the right. And it was a key tool in enabling Brexit to happen. Nostalgia itself, by its very nature, has to be kind of um, poorly, sort of hard to articulate. It's more of a notion than a set of concrete facts. It's a sense that things aren't somehow once as they were. And it's often difficult to pinpoint with any degree of accuracy what it is that has changed or what it is that has gone wrong. And people will often say, well, I don't know, but it's just not how it was. The things that I liked once don't seem to be here anymore. This has been a an easy one for the far right to capture and to blame essentially on a number of minority scapegoats. It's to do with immigration, or it's to do with permissive attitudes allowing different kinds of lifestyles to proliferate, or it's to do with, the slovenly standards of poor people, or it's to do with something else. And it's always a clue when you hear of this kind of downward punching that nostalgia is being weaponized by those with the power to weaponize it. And what has happened, I believe, in the past 50 years is as the forces of globalized neoliberal capital have been unleashed. This is always this kind of Marxist dictum of all that is solid vanishes into air or melts into air. And this is when we see abandoned high streets and communities, and the loss of the staples of life, institutions like the corner shop, or the kind of the small business in favor of supermarkets or online retailing or other forms of kind of monopoly capital. Marx was talking about the kind of the creative destruction of capitalism, the fact that capitalism, in the pursuit of profit, sweeps all before it. And this ultimately is where the longing for nostalgia comes from. Liam Stanley writes, Philip Hollobone, the Conservative backbench MP for Kettering, is noted for making a high number of short and sometimes irrelevant speeches in Parliament. This is apparently to improve his parliamentary participation stats on websites such as theyworkforyou.com, where even the briefest comment is classified as speech. His contribution in January 2017, when the House of Commons met for question time with the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, is best situated in this oeuvre. Before MPs had the chance to debate flood defence schemes and hill farmers, a Labour MP asked Minister George Eustace a question about how the state measures household food insecurity. Hollobone. His contribution, which had no direct relevance to the question, pondered whether poor families experiencing food insecurity can learn from the Second World War. Food insecurity is a terrible thing, and it is exacerbated by low-income households spending too much food on what they know is not on food that they know is not good for them. During the war, the wartime generation knew how to manage on a very tight budget, and nutrition actually improved for most households, including the very poorest. Could we learn some lessons from the wartime generation about how best to feed our people? The speech was picked up by the press. Left-wing tabloid newspaper The Mirror reported the comments as emblematic of the way in which the Conservative Party fails to take food insecurity seriously, which for the paper is ironic, given the government's punitive welfare reform policies. I'm interested in a different aspect of these comments, analysing how it is coherent to respond to the problem of poverty and food insecurity by referencing war. Hollowbone is not alone in looking back to the Second World War fondly. Yet let us not take this coherence for granted. Consider for a moment if Hollowbone had instead drawn on the history of the Anglo-Turkish War of 1807 to 1809 to imply a new scheme for how pensioners can stay adequately warm in the cold winter months. Instead of sticking to the Second World War comparison, those comments would likely fly past its audience, detached and meaningless, and disappear into the ether. But the Second World War analogies stick. Why is that? What makes these analogies and wider nostalgia for that period an intelligible response on this issue? So we could look at those comments on three different levels. I mean, the first is easy, and this is the thing I tend not to do. The first temptation is to dismiss these things as kind of simply absurdity, political lightweight saying ridiculous, preposterous things. But there is a reason why political lightweights say ridiculous, preposterous things, and it is always in the service of career. Now, the second thing is the second of the three ways to kind of observe this is to question who the audience is, who he is speaking to, and it's not to the select committee. He's trying to talk to the wider public. He's trying to position himself as a kind of a speaker of some profound and kind of timeless truth. And the third thing to ask is, what is it that the public or a certain fraction of the public is actually hearing? I mean, some people who listen to it hear it as the kind of the ridiculousness that it is, but for others, nostalgia. This kind of nostalgia, well, we should learn from the wartime generation, as if there are simply two generations. There is the people who exist now, and the people who were alive between 1939 and 1945. And that they didn't really have an existence before or after the war. They just existed in that kind of 5.5 year time pocket, and their values were magically somewhat different. When the bombs were raining down, they kind of became different sorts of people. They learned the value of mucking in together, pulling your socks up, being determined, scrimping and saving, putting those feelings to one side, and being resolute, and also being much more sensible. Now, obviously, when we're talking about in a time of mass austerity, where and these are very, very conservative figures, as I discussed with my good friend Dr. Rachel Morris, the stats present us with at a very, very minimum 300,000 austerity deaths, but it's way more than that. This kind of rhetoric of hunger is due to profligacy and wastefulness, and people buying Big Macs instead of buying a bag of porridge oats that'll last you for a month. All this sort of kind of silly bullshit, basically, that the kind of the political right tends to come out with when looking at the kind of the individual moral failings that lead to poverty. Of course, poverty is a structural phenomena, and poverty is very often created. It is something that political classes put a lot of time and effort into designing and constructing. But it has to be presented as kind of a moral failing. And the wartime generation, who we can hold up as being paragons of some sort of lost moral virtue. Austerity since 2010 had been presented as some kind of moral good. It had been presented as an antidote to the alleged profligacy of the Labour Party. Um, the Labour Party was blamed, or the world financial crisis was blamed by the kind of the ever demented British tabloid press on Labour's tendency to spend too much on social welfare. This had somehow led to a financial crisis. It had nothing to do with banks. And obviously, the way in which the narrative was spun was designed to protect banks from the possibility of any kind of hefty taxation or some kind of restorative economics following the financial bailout. The Conservatives, the point of getting the Conservatives into power for the City of London was to protect itself. And so we already had an idea that the poverty that Britain's working class families, for the most part, and so some middle class families who are also impoverished, but mainly working class families, the poverty that they were going to experience would be in some way restorative. That the days of the easy ride were over. The idlers and scroungers, and George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, talked about strivers and skivers, about people who walking past their house at 10 in the morning, the curtains were still shut. That kind of thing. That lazy people were going to be punished, and hardworking people who were kind of among the elect, they were among those who, among the righteous, were going to be spared and indeed perhaps even helped. But but this kind of profligacy, this inability to live within your means, that's where the association with the Second World War comes about. This idea that there was this wonderful generation who, when they didn't have things because they were being imports were being sunk at sea by the German U-boat packs, people made do. They learned how to make potato peel pie and things with powdered egg and all this kind of fantasy sort of stuff. I mean, yeah, there was all that in the war, and people did learn how to make do. But people kind of had a better idea of how to make do because they just experienced the Great Depression, and there was nothing particularly enjoyable or attractive about this degree of hardship. But as so often happens when we look backwards and try to kind of re-experience this era through the medium of television, it becomes romanticized. It becomes associated with a lost age of morals and propriety and of a more cohesive society. Now, all of this is, for the most part, complete ahistorical nonsense. There was a seminal book, Angus Calder, his book, The People's War, which actually pointed out that in that book and in the subsequent book, The Myth of the Blitz, that the idea of there being this kind of all in it together spirit of kind of social solidarity where everybody put aside their.
Healthcare can feel complicated. That's why Optum uses technology to connect the people and processes that make healthcare easier, more affordable, and more effective. We're making it clearer for you to know exactly what your benefits cover. And to help you better manage your health, we're coordinating care between your doctors and your technology. We believe better, simpler healthcare is always possible. That's healthy optimism. That's Optum. Visit Optum.com to learn more.
Class interests in the spirit of mucking in for the war effort is largely a fantasy. There was an immense amount of crime during the Blitz, people stealing from one another. The social attitudes did not change. They might have been kind of frozen for a while, but the attitudes of wealthier people towards the inconveniences of rationing and the resentments of poorer people, they stayed largely as they were. There were opportunities for wealthier people to avoid some of the privations of the war. And there were, the class stratification of British society did not go away into some glorious nationalist moment of kind of shared struggle. Um, the idea of the Blitz and the war years on the home front in general, that is kind of romanticized, um, indicate that there was, something kind of transformational happened to the British people. And at the end of the war, there's not much to suggest that that had happened, because people aren't like that, really. This idea that people ate better, well, yeah, I mean, in some cases that's true, but it's true in part due to due to basically the intervention of the state. That poorer people were actually able to eat better, partly due to the kind of the conditions of rationing. Not to say that eating less made people healthier, but that there was kind of a greater state intervention to ensure that people ate and received a kind of a full complement of healthy foodstuffs. So it had nothing to do with individualism. It had nothing to do with personal kind of some kind of moral transformation. And all that happens with this sort of stuff is you have cynical politicians cherry picking things that are going to resonate at the time with a kind of a moment that is greatly mythologized, but also greatly romanticized. So Liam Stanley writes, by proposing that Britain can learn some lessons from the wartime generation, Hollowbone is referring to one of the major myths of modern Britishness. During the People's War, the nation came together and made sacrifices, including over food, to help the war effort and ultimately defeat the Nazis. With regards to wartime lessons over how best to feed our people, Hollowbone is presumably referring to a combination of state interventions that included rationing, dig for victory, and communal feeding. Together, these wartime efforts to feed our people were about enforcing different, thriftier production and consumption as a collective sacrifice for the future of the nation. In this way, they were nationalizing in both design and effect. By claiming that Britain should return to this ethos, Hollowbone is implying a return to British values. Hollowbone is far from alone in turning to the past in general, and military successes in particular, to make sense of the present. Wartime is often considered Britain's finest hour. That Blitz Spirit, that keep calm and carry on, that stiff upper lip. The country buckled up, got fit, for the common good, a heroic and self-sacrificing fight to save Europe from fascism. As Hollowbone correctly indicates, controlling food and consumption was crucial to the British war effort. Rationing is perhaps the key reference point to the collective memory of wartime and post-war Britain, and is presumed to be a major way in which non-combatants made a sacrifice for the nation. Although only a limited range of food was truly rationed, the state enacted emergency legislation and created a bureaucracy to regulate and control consumption. The state deemed rationing necessary to ensure that productive capacity was filtered into war, to secure an affordable and equitable food supply to the population by anticipating shortages, and to maintain social and public order that could be vulnerable in the context of mass queuing or food shortages. Rationing made the state and nation congruent in a number of ways. For instance, rationing mobilized women for this national effort, albeit in uneven and gendered ways. Due to the gendered division of labour, in which women tended to take on feminized unpaid work to do with social reproduction of life and labour, the burden of implementing rationing fell disproportionately on housewives. At the height of the military mobilization in 1943, around 50% of women of working age were full-time housewives, and their socially reproductive work was intense. The state was very much aware of this division of labour. A Ministry of Food leaflet entitled Wise Housekeeping in Wartime starts with, "The line of food defence runs through all our homes. It may seem so simple, this urgent duty, that we may tend to overlook its meaning, its full meaning. The full meaning being, win the war, save the nation." It goes on, "True economy begins with careful buying. The woman with the basket has a vital part to play in home defence. By saving food, you may be saving lives." In this way, rationing incorporated a particular kind of domesticated femininity into the boundaries of Britishness. It's important to note that the idea of people coming together in a collective sacrifice to the nation is, unsurprisingly, far more complex than British collective memory might imply. The state consistently prosecuted people for breaking the emergency laws surrounding rationing. At its height, the Ministry of Food had 1,370 enforcement officers who sought to prevent food crime, detect black market dealings, and secure compliance through routine inspections. Between 1939 and 1951, the Ministry of Food made around 250,000 prosecutions, although few people were imprisoned. Interventions went beyond rationing and related controls and extended into areas that we might today call social policy. For example, the wartime British state embarked on a communal feeding project of heavily subsidised canteens. These canteens were originally going to be named communal feeding centres until Winston Churchill intervened and suggested British restaurants instead, because it conjured images of a good meal rather than communism in the workhouse. At their peak, there were 2,160 British restaurants, and by 1942, about 1 in 5 Britons had eaten at one. There were other feeding schemes too, including the Rural Pie Scheme, whereby pies made by British restaurants were transported to feed farm workers unable to reach the city. Reviewing the mass observation collection on British restaurants makes for interesting reading. A housewife reports her displeasure because a table of youths were making a noise and eating with their hats on. Snobby, she asks of herself, perhaps. Another diner reflects on the different atmosphere because people are willing to talk to one another. I had a curious feeling that I was at the start of a new and wonderful experiment. The contrast to the post-crash rise of food banks could hardly be starker. So there was aspects of collectivism and aspects of state led collectivism that obviously the Conservative Party, at the height of austerity, would not want to have kind of emphasised. And the way in which the memory of rationing, the memory of the Blitz, the memory of privation is kind of used and channeled for an attempt to kind of almost sort of kind of pervert the idea of national purpose and national mission. There could have been nothing further from the idea of national mission than austerity from 2010 to the present day. What happened instead was that enormous levels of inequality are allowed to grow and to increase, life-threatening levels of inequality, the destruction of the public realm, the destruction of the amenities that we all live on, and their kind of subsequent privatization, and the idea of the nation itself not really kind of existing in any kind of cohesive sense, which in some ways explains Brexit in 2016. And David Edgerton makes the argument that whatever Brexit was, however kind of incoherent it was some kind of explosive demand for national identity again. So I'm going to look more at this book in the future, Britain Alone by Liam Stanley. It's really, really great piece of academic work. But I'll leave you there. Just to remind you that we're getting closer and closer to the start of January, where I'm going to be announcing our study days. So stay tuned for that. Anyway, thanks very much, everybody, and I'll catch you on the next podcast. All the best. Bye-bye.
engines rev, are you listening?
It's that time of year again. Happy Honda Days, where you can drive in a Honda wonderland of your own with a great offer on a fun-to-drive new Accord, Civic, CR-V, or HR-V. Hurry into your local Honda dealer and experience the wonder of Happy Honda Days with a great deal on your favorite Honda today.
Driving in a Honda wonderland.
Contact your local Washington area Honda dealer for a great deal today.
See dealer for financing details. Exclude Civic Si and Type R.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.